Hello, juniors. We are going to be talking about chapters 8 and 9 today. Picked a few quotes from those. You'll notice not so many from 9. To be perfectly frank, I didn't quite know what to make of it. It's a lot of John waking up, realizing that the Washington compound's being bombed, a lot of descriptive kind of bliss from Fitzgerald, but for our analytical purposes, I felt like we could accomplish it quickly. But I think I said other videos would be quick, and probably most of you would disagree with me on that. Anyways, quick shout out to the people who showed up to office hours. It's by no means mandatory, it's just to check in. So if you have a question, feel free to join them. If you want to get updates on assignments or throw an idea at me and see if it would work, feel free to do that. But this week's office hours was really just a few of us getting together, I think feeling like we were having some social contact and talking about new releases on streaming services and the best place that's still doing delivery and takeout. So I think that's important as well, just a sense of normalcy and to know that everybody still exists, which I think sometimes it's easy to talk yourself out of believing. Anyways, we'll hop into these quotes here. 8 and 9 really just cover, I think, the falling action of the novella, and we can talk about what the climax was. I guess we haven't specifically talked about that yet, but we have John realizing how dire and morbid the situation at the Washington compound is, notably that he's going to be executed fairly soon. And of course, the attack on the Washington compound that, allows Kismine, Jasmine, and John to escape, but also leads to Percy's mother, and Braddock's death, most likely by the end of the novella. So, first quote here. Every day, Mr. Washington and the two young men, that's Percy and John, went hunting or fishing in the deep forest or played golf around the somnolent course, games which John diplomatically allowed his host to win, or swam in the mountain coolness of the lake. John found Mr. Washington a somewhat exacting personality, utterly uninterested in any ideas or opinions except his own. I think that there's a bit of kind of understatement there by saying somewhat exacting personality. I would say he's the definition of exacting and saying that things must be his way. But I think we see perhaps, if this is kind of how John would phrase it, where that comes from. John, up through the end of 9, still seems to believe that the mindset of the Washingtons, the kind of ambition of the Washingtons, is not all bad. And I think we see that John diplomatically allowed his host to win these golf games that they were playing. That John understood kind of flattering or placating his hosts by letting them win, letting them think they're the smartest, they're the richest, they're the best, and John just kind of sitting there and nodding and thanking them for allowing him to exist at the same time that they do. John still seems to be buying into that as something to be admired and something to be modeled and something that you submit to in the hopes that someday you can become that. I think we do see that John very kind of sadly still admires the Washingtons and what they stand for. He seems to be giving, a sense of awareness, I think, in Fitzgerald's last sentence here, that Washington's kind of a pompous jerk, but at the same time, not enough of a pompous jerk to not want to be around and flatter. So, we'll move on here. John learned from Kismine that Jasmine had never recovered from the shock and disappointment caused her by the termination of the World War, just as she was about to start for Europe as a canteen expert. She'd even pined away for a time, and Braddock Washington had taken steps to promote a new war in the Balkans, but she had seen a photograph of some wounded Serbian soldiers and lost interest in the whole proceedings. So I think Fitzgerald's constantly walking this fine line between making fun of world events that still would have been very fresh in the minds of the world at that time. I think this was published in 22. World War I, I'm going off of memory here, maybe wound down in 1914 or 1916. I'm sure somebody will call me out on that, and I thank them in advance. But anyways, the idea that Braddock Washington was going to restart the World War so that his daughter could get a chance to go kind of nurse and work in the war. But then when she sees the reality of the war, the wounded Serbian soldiers, she loses interest in the whole proceedings. I think it's just Fitzgerald doing his best to go so far in hyperbole, so far in exaggeration, as to say that Braddock Washington and Jasmine and Kismine and John are so kind of soulless and selfish that they would start a world war just so that they could get a chance to see whether or not they liked, being a nurse or being a soldier. That damn the people that it affects otherwise, damn the people who die in the process. I want my kids to see if that's a job that they want. So I think probably I'm willing to bet a bit of a controversial story, the same way that if we were making kind of these exaggerations about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or to be a little more timely, the COVID-19 outbreak, there would probably be people who would say, not right to make fun of, at least right now. So I think, whether or not it's clever or funny, it's certainly a bold move to bring up that somebody like Braddock Washington would restart the World War, the Great War, to let his kids kind of, play soldier, play nurse in the process. All right. So, but, inquired John curiously, who did plan all your wonderful reception rooms and halls and approaches and bathrooms? Well, answered Percy, I blush to tell you, but it was a moving picture fellow. He was the only man we found who was used to playing with an unlimited amount of money. Excuse me. Though he did tuck his napkin in his collar and couldn't read or write. So if you remember what's kind of going on right before this, Percy is giving a little background of the Braddock estate, how they brought, they kidnapped the most famous poets and architects and set designers, things like this, and brought them to make the Braddock estate. And because they were, passionate artists or just thoughtful people, they mentally couldn't hold up, that they tried to escape. They went crazy. Now they're in this asylum, I think in Connecticut somewhere. Anyways, the person who does really well in this estate that they're at is this moving picture fellow, probably some sort of director. And again, in 22, these are brand new. But I think the idea that the Washingtons like him speaks to the idea of money, pop culture, probably a sense that, like all new media, it's going to kind of destroy the minds of the public, which, we're still to some degree saying about movies today. But I think it shows that the Braddocks had much in common with Hollywood, that they were kind of morally bankrupt, that they were intellectually bankrupt, but that, appearances and money were the most important things here. And if you go on and read what the description of this director is, he was the only man we found who was used to playing with an unlimited amount of money. I think, again, Fitzgerald's drawing this connection between the moneyed elite, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Mellons, and also Hollywood, which at that time was becoming, the Hollywood that to some degree we still know, a kind of center of the universe, so to speak, in terms of entertainment. And even though this man is one of the few people in the world who, like billionaires, is used to an unlimited amount of money, he tucks his napkin in his collar and couldn't read or write. He's pretty uneducated, maybe boorish with his manners, doesn't really understand how to act well. But the most important thing that he has in common with the Washingtons is he has seen that much money and he can spend it without thinking about it. And so I think Fitzgerald is really kind of putting Hollywood through the ringer. He'd probably be somebody who would be a fun Oscars host if we could get him. But anyways, making fun of Hollywood is kind of the moral low point in America, that it's people who have more money than they know what to do with and have been made awful by it and are neither educated nor mannered, simply willing to spend a lot of money to make themselves happy. I think Fitzgerald's being very kind of cutting and scathing and acidic in describing Hollywood that way and comparing the Washingtons to people like Hollywood directors at that time. All right, I could never get father's permission to marry you at all. Next to that, I'd rather elope. It's terrible for wealthy people to be married in America at present. They always have to send out bulletins to the press saying that they're going to be married in remnants, which or when what they mean is just a peck of old secondhand pearls and some used lace worn once by the Empress Eugene. We have Fitzgerald really playing on this idea of how clueless Kismine is. And I guess we don't really blame Kismine for that. She had Braddock as a father, and she's only been kept on the estate here, I think, with the exception of maybe going to that girls' school next year to kind of learn manners. But anyways, Kismine seems to be looking at how tough life is for wealthy people. And the tough part is you've got to send out these bulletins, these announcements in the paper saying that you're going to be married in remnants, that you're going to, look nice. But what they mean is secondhand pearls and some used lace once worn by the Empress Eugene. I mean, these are kind of her idea of a tragedy is not wearing your own kind of one-of-a-kind lace to a wedding. And we see this throughout the next 2 chapters, Kismine saying these things to John, and even though John is somewhat privileged, having gone to St. Midas school, he's nowhere near the state that the Washingtons are at. And Kismine is having trouble relating, especially I think in a moral sense here in just a little bit, to quote-unquote average people, even quote-unquote very wealthy people. She's just from literally a different world. And so the things that she says, I think, strike us as kind of funny in how clueless and how stuck up they are. But at the same time, can we blame someone like Kismine for turning out that way? If it's a story of environment and influence, maybe the point that Fitzgerald is making is that America's, or at least young America, is the same way as Kismine, that if we give it cultural fathers of a certain type, that if we only allow them to see certain parts of the world, how can we expect them to ever kind of see the world in a different way or sympathize with others who don't have enough? Maybe it's a larger metaphor for America at that time, but either way, we get a bit of a laugh out of how clueless and snobbish Kismine comes across even when she's trying to relate. All right. So, do you mean that they told and your father had them removed? Worse than that, she muttered brokenly. Father took no chances, and Jasmine kept writing them to come, and they had such a good time. She was overcome by a paroxysm of grief. We see here Kismine, to some degree, trying to avoid responsibility. She says that Jasmine was the one getting all these guests to come to the compound who the father would then kill to make sure nobody told about the Washington compound. But we also see, I think, Kismine, if wealth was the issue in the last statement, thinking of kind of morality, what's right and wrong, whether it's wrong to kill somebody, being clueless here. Well, because Jasmine invited them and wanted them to come out to the estate, and because these guests had such a good time before they were murdered, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And so, again, I think we see Kismine just playing by a rule book that's utterly unimaginable to everybody else, even John Unger, that to her, if you have to kill somebody to let them be your friend for a while beforehand, and that makes you happy, well, that made you happy, and that's all that needs to be in play. The life, the happiness, the well-being of another person. The only time that's important is if it's making you happy, and the moment it stops doing that, they're entirely disposable in the Washington family's mind. I think we see that with the men in the pit, to some degree the enslaved people there, maybe even with each other. I mean, Percy has turned out to be a real piece of work, along with Jasmine and Kismine. So perhaps Braddock has sacrificed his own children in the way that the only time that he really cares about them is when they seem to be satisfying his ego. But either way, we see that she's as morally screwed up as she is in terms of what kind of money is normal, or at least even a lot of money in the world at large. They always had a very good time. She'd give them the nicest presents towards the last. I shall probably have visitors too. I'll harden up to it. We can't let such an inevitable thing as death stand in the way of enjoying life while we have it. Think of how lonesome it'd be out here if we never had anyone. Why, father and mother have sacrificed some of their best friends just as we have. I think we see Kismine either doing a fairly good job at rationalizing this, at least to herself, or she's already gone too far and is somebody who thinks murder has its place in the world and, probably should be done quite a bit. We see her saying she'd given them the nicest presents towards the last. In essence, that it didn't matter that these people died because they got to enjoy wealth for a moment. I mean, I guess going back to Great Gatsby, we could ask that about Jay Gatsby. Was his life meaningful or fulfilling because he got to have that giant house in West Egg and have the parties? I think Fitzgerald suggests no, that made life emptier than if he had kind of taken a more traditional route. At the same time, it seems like Jasmine thinking that people will be happy and therefore have lived a life full enough to warrant ending it by giving them things that they wanted, nice presents, makes it okay. It seems like Fitzgerald's suggesting that the idea that happiness or meaning in life comes from wealth is totally wrong. I shall probably have visitors too. I'll harden up to it. So we see Kismine saying, when you feel bad about committing murder, it's basically you just being immature, and that you'll harden up to it. You'll get used to killing people. Very disturbing statements for this kind of young, innocent Kismine to be saying to John in this loving moment that they're having together. But again, her environment would tell her this. She's got Jasmine who is telling her, yeah, it's tough the first time Dad kills your friends, but after a while you get used to it and you stop kind of worrying about it. So again, I think we have to wonder if Fitzgerald wants us to hold Kismine as morally responsible as everybody around her, or say, Kismine had no other compass to go by. We can't let such an inevitable thing as death stand in the way of enjoying life while we have it. Well, I guess death is inevitable, but normally I think most people don't get murdered. So she's, I think, being a bit of an equivocator there, using that idea that death is inevitable to justify murder, when I think most people, when they talk about inevitable death, might mean illness or an accident, a lot of different things. Rarely do I think we think of that as, murder after meeting a rich person. And then finally, think of how lonesome it'd be out here if we never had anyone. Why, father and mother have sacrificed some of their best friends just as we have. Again, kind of playing to her own self-interest. I am okay with these people being killed by Braddock because we need to have friends too. Think about us here. And again, I think that rightfully strikes us as one of the most unbelievably selfish statements a human being could make. But to Kismine and on the Braddock estate, those kinds of statements are reality. Those kinds of statements aren't the crazy things. Those are the normal things. John is crazy for being terrified that he's going to get killed. So we laugh at it as outsiders, but yet again, I think Fitzgerald wants us to wonder, should we blame people who are in a situation like that? I think to some degree, yes. But at the same time, if you never have another compass, if you're totally kind of blocked off from the rest of the world, how could you realize how wrong that sounds to other people? And especially if you have somebody like Braddock Washington dictating the steps of your life to you, somebody that powerful, somebody that pig-headed, somebody that stubborn, wouldn't it be easy, just as a matter of existence, to start internalizing those thoughts? Not saying that Kismine's a good person. I never want to go get, a mocha frappe with her, but I think we have to ask if she's as responsible for her morality as Braddock or Percy or some of the older kids in the family. All right, I fell in love with you, and I'm honestly sorry you're going to be put away, though I'd rather you'd be put away than ever kiss another girl. Oh, you would you? Cried John ferociously. Much rather, besides I've always heard that a girl can have more fun with a man whom she knows she could never marry. Oh, why did I tell you? I've probably spoiled your whole good time now, and we were really enjoying things when you didn't know it. I knew it would make things sort of depressing for you. Again, Kismine being totally unaware and kind of downplaying things. I know that knowing you would be murdered would be sort of depressing to you. Well, I think that would be, at a minimum, totally depressing. And I think we also kind of have that connection to Daisy Buchanan again there. I've always heard that a girl can have more fun with a man whom she knows she can never marry. It seems like Kismine is looking at romance in that way, that, just like the idea of being with Gatsby was far more intriguing to Daisy than actually leaving Tom and going through a divorce and having to share custody of Pammy and having to move between West Egg and East Egg. The idea of kind of sitting back and just enjoying, well, what would it be like? Well, this is a fling we're keeping secret. I think we see Kismine giving that same idea there, that one of the benefits of her father killing all the people that come to the compound is that you never have to face the ugly realities of human connection. You never have to go through some of the difficult or some of the trying parts of marriage, or really just a relationship. And again, I think Fitzgerald would say those, in a way, are the best parts. Those are the parts that give meaning to everything else. If it was just fun all the time, like Gatsby's parties every night, it becomes pointless and boring and empty. But Kismine is totally on board with boring and pointless and empty. And so for her, the idea that her father's going to kill John is made a little bit better by thinking, well, that way this can kind of stay a fantasy that I can think about what would have happened rather than having to face the reality that might not be the same of what would actually happen. All right. Then we have, after all of that, Kismine revealing to John that her father's going to kill him, John not really knowing what to make of that, Braddock Washington kind of stumbling across them and chastising them for being out together on his compound. We have John saying his love for her returned and settled placidly on his heart. She was his. She would go with him to share his dangers. He put his arm about her and kissed her fervently. After all, she loved him. She had saved him, in fact. So this is right after John says he's escaping, and Kismine says that she'll go with him. But I think we see again that immature sense of love. If anything, Kismine in this chapter has come across as a psychopath. But John loves her because she was his. She would go with him to share his dangers. It seems like Fitzgerald's saying either that's true for everybody or kind of true for young love, that it's more important just to have a person there than to know what kind of person that is. After all, she loved him. She had saved him, in fact. I mean, I guess she did. She also just got done saying it wouldn't be such a bad thing if Braddock Washington murdered him. But we have John feeling like he's accepted, maybe for the first time, or maybe for the first time deeply by somebody in the Washington family, maybe for the first time by somebody romantically. Either way, I think it's ironic that after this long discussion about why John should be so upset with being murdered, John decides that he loves her, and that's because she loves him. So going on to chapter 9 here, it was only a step to the tower lift, and as she pressed the button that shot them upward, he put his arms around her in the darkness and kissed her mouth. Romance had come to John Unger at last. A minute later, they had stepped upon the star-wide platform. I was really struck with the idea that romance had come to John Unger at last, and I think that idea of romance there is important. Fitzgerald doesn't say love, which I think is different than romance. He picks the word romance very, I think, intentionally. And it's not just the idea that one person cares about another. I think it's the idea that everything's exciting and everything's dangerous and everything is meaningful. And so it seems like one of the reasons that romance came to John Unger at last wasn't necessarily just because Kismine was there and kissed him, because we know that they had done that, back, I think, around the first time that they met, but that life is now exciting, and the raid on the Washington compound makes life dangerous and important and thrilling. Maybe John sees himself as becoming a man by defying somebody like Braddock Washington, by deciding to escape the compound, do what no other man seemingly could do. I guess the Italian teacher did, I don't know. But anyways, I think that idea of romance, in a way, defining this moment for John more than love, is an important distinction to make, because his love for Kismine, I think we see at the end of chapter 8, seems a little weird. That idea of romance can be much more explainable here, that the threat and the kind of beauty and the excitement of everything happening around him is what John is most concerned with. All right, second to last quote here. Kismine begged John, "You'll be glad when I tell you that this attack came on the eve of my murder. If I hadn't heard that guard shoot off his gun back by the pass, I should now be stone dead. I can't hear you, cried Kismine, intent on the scene before her. You'll have to talk louder. I simply said, shouted John, that we'd better get out before they begin to shell the chateau. A really funny scene where I think John realizes who Kismine is. He's telling her, hey, you're going to be glad to know that I wasn't murdered, because had this battle not started, your father had sent these 3 men in to kill me while I was sleeping just now. And Kismine says she can't hear John because she's watching the bombing very excitedly, thinks it's a great show. Instead of John repeating himself, he says, I simply said that we'd better get out before they begin to shell the chateau. He doesn't repeat what he said up here. And I think one of the reasons is he realizes Kismine isn't going to understand, or maybe not even going to care. It seems in a way to be a rehash of their argument from chapter 8, but this time John, for whatever's happening, realizes that's not who Kismine is. And I guess we could see this as a positive thing. John's loving Kismine for who she is, flaws included, I guess murderous flaws included. But I think we could also see it as John being very willing to accept an awful human being as, somebody important to him. I guess, depending on how optimistically or pessimistically you read this story, you're probably somewhere between those. But John realizes Kismine doesn't care about that story, that's not going to interest her, that, maybe saving her life will, but knowing that John's life was saved is not something that is going to kind of generate any sort of meaningful discussion. Last comment here, and I think it's an important one to end on because it sets up Kismine, Jasmine, and John leaving and deciding kind of how life is going to be once they escape the compound. We'll be poor, won't we? Like people in books. And I'll be an orphan and utterly free. Free and poor, what fun. She stopped and raised her lips to him in a delighted kiss. It's impossible to be both together, said John grimly. People have found that out, and I should choose to be free as preferable of the two. So Kismine, just like her sister, thinking that it would be a great thrill to be a nurse in war until she sees the realities of it, I think we see Kismine in the same way. She's read books about poor people and orphans, and she thinks it sounds fantastic, that you're utterly free and poor, what fun. She seems to have no idea what the kind of daily struggle or loss or pain of a life in poverty or a life as an orphan is. She just sees the kind of excitement of something different for a moment. And I think we get the same sense with Jasmine in the war, that were Kismine to get any realistic view of poverty, she would change her mind instantly. But Kismine is kind of so either insulated or evil or arrogant or ignorant, whichever one of those I guess you'd like, that she doesn't realize the reality of poverty and that she's going to have a much more difficult time with that life than she has any idea of. John, however, I think ends this chapter on a bit of a snobbish note again. If he's kind of been our eyes towards the Washington family and the readers identifying more with John than anybody else this whole story, he says it's impossible to be both together. And I think if we read back, we have to think of that as being free and poor. So John's saying you can be poor and, controlled, or you can be free and rich. You can't be free and poor. You can't be controlled and rich. I mean, maybe the last one we could debate, but John's saying at least you can't be free and poor. And he notes that given a choice, he's going to be free. So I think we see John, I don't think anybody necessarily chooses poverty, or if people do, it's probably very few and very complicated. But John is saying the idea of money and power is important to me. And if I have a choice to be free or poor, I'm going to be free. So, whether or not that amounts to arrogance, whether or not that amounts to just wanting a decent life, whether or not that amounts to intelligence, I guess is up to you. But either way, it shows that John still values, I think, the traits of the privileged: independence, wealth, status, autonomy, freedom. These are all ideas that I think we've associated with the kind of socially powerful groups in society. And John says he plans to remain as socially powerful as possible by the end of this. So we'll stop there, finish up 10 and 11, most likely by the end of the day tomorrow, so your questions will be due probably Tuesday night. I hope you are all having a good week, and I will talk to you